Because students leave school without financial skills, millions of educated people pursue their profession successfully, but later find themselves struggling financially. They work harder, but don't get ahead. What is missing from the education is not how to make money, but how to spend it. You don't have to wait until you reach financial independence to start enjoying your life. You can do that much earlier and start living a life that you love and that's true to you. Welcome to Freedom Before FI. Using FIRE and life design techniques, we help you create freedom on your way to FI instead of waiting until you're retired to do the things that light you up. I'm your host Greg, a FIRE movement and life design enthusiast. If you're itching to get freedom now, then let's do this. Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Freedom Before FI. I hope your week is going well. For me and the missus, we're actually preparing for a trip to Thailand. We'll be exploring Bangkok and Krabi for a couple of weeks, and I can't wait to eat the food there. For sure, I'm going to come back a bit heavier. Alright, so let's get on with the show. In some of my previous episodes, I talked about how books can be life-changing. So in the next few episodes, I wanted to give you some of the biggest lessons I took away from a handful of my favourite books about FI. Some of the takeaways might be basic, but they're fundamental in our quest for freedom. And it's always good to remind ourselves of the fundamentals, right? So as it says in the title, the first book I'll jump into is Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, released back in 1997 and selling over 32 million copies since. I liked it because it was more of a fun read and introduced you to concepts instead of being too serious and too numbers driven. Essentially, the concept of the book is the money lessons he learns from his best friend's dad, who's a businessman, a saver, and a savvy investor, also known as the rich dad. So the poor dad, on the other hand, is his actual dad, but he's not exactly poor per se. I think that was more of a marketing tactic to have a catchy title. He's just more focused on academia and working hard in a career and not so much into saving and investing. Now, I was a bit late to the party with this book. I didn't actually read it until my late 20s, but it kicked off my financial independence journey for sure. Like, it was so mind-blowing for me. When I finished the book, it was like I just stepped out of the Matrix. I was definitely living life wrong before that, and I was just following the herd. So anyway, I'll be telling you my 3 biggest lessons that I learned from the book. Now let's jump into the first one. So the first earth-shattering takeaway I took from the book was the concept of lifestyle inflation and essentially being in the rat race. We refer to it more as lifestyle creep in the FIRE movement. So lifestyle inflation is essentially increasing your expenses as you increase your salary. For example, if you get a pay rise, instead of being able to save and invest more, lifestyle inflation is thinking, oh, I got a pay rise, that means I can afford a bigger car, a bigger house, or move to a more affluent city. Of course, the financially savvy person would not increase their expenses, and they would prefer to add it to their saving and investing system, accelerating their time to freedom. So the funny thing is, when I was reading the book back then, I was literally living that lifestyle inflation life, like the typical example the author used in the book. I think before I read the book, I actually did buy a brand new car, which was really unnecessary. Fortunately, I came to my senses, sold it, and bought a second-hand car that was quarter of the price, and it was a solid car that lasted me for years. Anyway, I'll just read a quick extract from the book that sums this up. So the context of the paragraph talks about a typical newly married and educated couple living in a small apartment. So the author writes, they decide to save money to buy their dream home so they can have kids. They now have 2 incomes and they begin to focus on their careers. Their incomes begin to increase. As the income goes up, their expenses go up as well. As a result of their income going up, they decide to go out and buy the house of their dreams. Once in their house, they have a new tax called property tax. Then they buy a new car, new furniture, and new appliances to match their new house. All of a sudden, they wake up and their liabilities column is full of mortgage debt and credit card debt. They're now trapped in the rat race. A child comes along, they work harder, the process repeats itself. Anyway, let's go over to big lesson number 2. Okay, so lesson number 2 is about financial literacy. Building our personal finance knowledge is key if we want to obtain freedom. They don't really teach us this at school. If we want to build wealth, this is literally the foundation of it. Now, I mentioned this in episode 6, titled How to Buy Your Freedom. Step number 2 is education and financial literacy. Step number 1 was knowing what your ultimate goals were and what does freedom mean to you. So there are some basics of personal finance that you need to know, like budgeting, saving, net worth, credit and debt, inflation, interest, tax, retirement savings, compound interest. And those are just some of the things you need to know. Once you have a good idea of the basics, you can then dive into more of the FIRE concepts, which I'll talk about on this podcast. So here's an extract from the book about financial literacy, also known as financial aptitude. So he writes, because students leave school without financial skills, millions of educated people pursue their profession successfully, but later find themselves struggling financially. They work harder, but don't get ahead. What is missing from the education is not how to make money, but how to spend it, what to do after you make it. It's called financial aptitude. What to do with the money once you make it, how to keep people from taking it from you, how long you keep it, and how hard that money works for you. A person can be highly educated, professionally successful, and financially illiterate. These people often work harder than they need to because they learn how to work hard, but not how to have their money work for them. Alright, I think you get the point on that one. Educate yourself, read books, listen to podcasts, read blogs, whatever you need to do to build your financial literacy. Alright, so let's go over to lesson number 3. Okay, lesson number 3 is a basic concept under the financial literacy umbrella, and it's understanding assets and liabilities. So this concept alone, although basic, really kickstarted my investing journey. So in the book, I kept being reminded of the phrase, buy income generating assets. You'll see it all the time in the book. And I remember during the time I was reading it, throughout my day, I was always thinking like, I need to get me some of those income generating assets. I kept thinking that all the time. So the key lesson is to know the difference between the two, an asset and a liability. Here's an extract from the book. So the author writes, Rule 1, you must know the difference between an asset and a liability and buy assets. If you want to be rich, this is all you need to know. It's rule number 1, it's the only rule. This may sound absurdly simple, but most people have no idea how profound this rule is. Most people struggle financially because they do not know the difference between an asset and a liability. Rich people acquire assets, the poor and middle class acquire liabilities, but they think they are assets. End of quote. Okay, so essentially, assets put money in your pockets, while a liability is something that takes money out of your pocket. So an example of an asset could be like stocks, bonds, real estate, inventory, cash. Liabilities, on the other hand, are things like credit card payments, car loans, and a house mortgage, for example. Of course, in the FIRE movement, we love index fund investing, which is an income-generating asset, as the value increases over time and it gives you dividends. So the money you invest works for you. Alright, so those are the 3 big lessons I learned from the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. As I said, they're quite basic, but really fundamental learnings I have come to understand in my journey. So as a quick recap, lesson number 1 was understanding lifestyle inflation or lifestyle creep. Lesson number 2 is building your financial literacy or financial aptitude. Lesson number 3 was understanding the difference between assets and liabilities and to buy more income-generating assets if you want to have more freedom. If you think this episode would help a friend, please don't hesitate to share it with them. The show notes can be found at freedombeforefire.substack.com. If you have a question or want to connect, feel free to send me an email at freedombeforephi@proton.me. That's freedombeforephi@proton.me. If you found this show useful and want to be notified of future episodes, you can follow us on Spotify or Apple via the show's main page or on whatever app you're using right now. And lastly, if you've just learned one good thing that will help you in your journey and you want to help us out here, please do leave a 5-star rating on your podcast player app. If you're using Apple Podcasts, you can even leave a nice review by scrolling to the bottom of the podcast page. That would help us out loads. All right, so that is the end of this episode. Have an awesome day. Stay tuned next week as I'll be giving you my lessons from the book Quit Like a Millionaire. I'll catch you then. And as always, practice gratitude, live life by your design, and do things that make you smile. You got this.